Hello, and welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations About Horror. My name is Katherine Troyer, and joining me as always is Anthony Tresca.
Hello.
This is a podcast devoted to thoughtful discussions about that fine line between the horrific and the just horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is, for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we are so very excited and thankful for you to be joining us today as we talk about 2019's Pet Sematary.
This episode is going to be a bit of a departure from a pattern that we've sort of established where a film has been very well received and we have a problem with it, or it's been sort of completely undersold and we think it deserves more credit. Pet Sematary doesn't quite fit into that category, either in terms of the response to it or in terms of how we feel about it.
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and get into a little bit more of like the critical response to the film now, because it's going to be important for framing our discussion. Pet Sematary got middling reviews, like very mixed. I would not say bad, but not an overwhelmingly good response either. The Rotten Tomatoes score from the critics was a 57, which we've
talked about for horror is not terrible.
No.
But certainly no one's going to be proud that they've achieved a 57.
It's still a Rotten Tomato. It's still not enough to pass any type of class, so not great. The Metacritic score is a 57, so, I mean, pretty much the same. It is the same. That is the same number.
That is the same number.
I said the same number twice.
Yes, and thus you know that Anthony is not a math major.
No math for me. The cinema score from the audience was a C+, so they said it passed.
Wow, C+ is pretty high.
Yeah, I mean, that's not just a C. That's a C with honor.
Yeah, oof. Okay.
However, the audience score on Rotten Tomatoes is a 34, so they really hated it. But the audience score on Metacritic is a 5.8. So they're not terrible reviews.
No, they're
except for the 34 that the audience
Right, yeah,
gave.
that's
like,
pretty bad.
That's pretty, unanimous. I think those people
That's you may put it on in the background while you're folding laundry type movie, but definitely not when you're going to even remotely pay to see.
Exactly. So this film is not... It doesn't fall in, like what you were saying, overwhelming critic response or just totally being ignored. This film is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, but we wanted to talk about this film for a couple of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted to talk about it in part as a response to the discussion we had about Midsommar and this idea of, can something be a horror film when it's kind of, defeating all of the columns that one has erected of here's what a horror film is.
Because Midsommar, so, as I say, just so, joyfully just knocks down all of the tropes and says, hey, I'm still gonna do this thing, and it's gonna be pretty good. And it may not be exactly what you typically define, like you were saying, as horror, but it is. Trust me.
But on the other hand, right, Pet Sematary is also asking us to trust it, but in a really different way, because they're saying, look, if ever there's a checklist of, here are the things that a, quote, effective horror film does, we've done them. We've done them all.
We're good, right?
Yeah, it does not mean that we've achieved our goal. And
we're scary, right?
Oh, gosh, if only. And so that's what Anthony and I wanted to actually talk about, was this idea of, how is it that a film can not succeed, as we will argue that Pet Sematary does not, despite the fact that on the surface, if you just pitch the film to someone, it should work in almost every way possible.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you're right with the pitch aspect, and which is why it's been on the studio's mind for so very, very, very long. I mean, Paramount has been thinking about wanting to produce this picture since March 5th, 2010. So they have had 9 years to work on...
Well, not quite, because they had to...
okay, fine.
But close.
9-ish years.
Right. It's a long time.
It's a long time, with the same writer, Matt Greenberg, being hired to write the screenplay. And so they've had all that time to just develop it for its eventual release in March 16th, 2019. So pretty much almost exactly 9 years apart. Pet Sematary is, as I said, a 2019 horror film directed by Kevin Kolsch and Dennis Weidman. It follows the Stephen King novel, obviously, written in 1983, Pet Sematary, and it's the second adaptation following the first adaptation in 1989. Stars Jason Clarke, John Lithgow, and Amy Shymetz.
It's interesting that they decided to make this adaptation. So first, from a financial standpoint, it makes sense, because if you're going to adapt from Stephen King, you know that you're going to get enough people to see the film whether or not it's good, right? Like, that's just kind of...
Assuming you do one of his more mainstream
Yes.
ones, and Pet Sematary is undoubtedly
Yes.
one of his more mainstream ones, because, I mean, as Stephen King talks about in numerous interviews, he's like, this is the one book where my editor said, hey, you might have gone too far in dealing directly with the children and animals in this one.
But despite the fact that, you know, it has King's name attached to it, it is interesting they decided to adapt from a film that, the first film, that did not have very fantastic reviews either. Again, it was pretty middling.
Yeah, 50% on Rotten Tomatoes, so exactly middling.
Yes, exactly. So there, I think already we're running into an example of this checklist, right? Have a story from, like, the horror writer, check. But have it be a story that hasn't been adapted very successfully, right? So, like, everything on this checklist, there's this, like, hidden thing that in fine print, right? So, and this is just the start of that.
So the main difference between this adaptation and the 1989 version, as well as Stephen King's original book, is that they've made one very major change. It's the differentiating of the child who dies. And Stephen King actually talked about that in an interview with Entertainment Weekly. And he was like, yeah, it's fine. They did a good job. It's all nuts. You can take Route 301 and go to Tampa, or you can take Route 17 and go to Tampa. Both times you're going to come out at Tampa. So he's like, any changes they made didn't matter, because, as he'll later go on to talk about in this article, Stephen King loves this adaptation. So who are we to disagree with Stephen King?
That is a good question. And that does make me feel as though the answer is no one. I'm no one compared to... but you're right. I mean... I would agree with him on that it doesn't matter in some ways. Well, okay, let me actually use his metaphor. It is true that both routes will take you to Tampa. Yeah. That is 100% correct. However, taking the scenic route versus taking the route that goes through the desert where you don't see anything, right? And I realize there's no desert with Tampa, but you know, that sort of idea, right? It is a different experience. The end result may be the same, but the experience was fundamentally different. Mm-hmm. And I would say that this is just kind of one of many examples in this film where, again, if you sort of have that checklist, the kid dies, check, in tiny, small, fine print, but it's a different child, and therefore it might be a completely different experience, and oh, by the way, it doesn't matter, I don't know, maybe it does, yes it does, right? Like, there's just a lot of that sort of things happening in the film. So what we were going to do, if you've been listening to our podcast for a while, you know that usually we have a very, like, clear ritual, right? We do our introduction, then Anthony, like, kindly turns the mic over to me. Mm-hmm. I share a critical framework, and then I'm like, but Anthony, tell us more about how the film was made. And then he does, and then we kind of go into the things that we liked and didn't like.
I'm loving this bit of meta commentary about our own way in which we make a podcast.
Well, we've spent a lot of time talking about the best way to do it, and we're purposefully deviating from that in this particular episode.
Because here we don't want to adhere to any checklists.
That's
as
right.
We've learned from Pet Sematary, doesn't always work out too well.
Yeah, so I thought what would be nice would be to kind of just go through, like, the things that we feel are checklist type items that should make this a really powerful horror film, and that occasionally do, because there are some really great moments in here, and then the ones that just are checkmarked, but when you read the fine print you realize that it's not good enough. And so things to keep in mind to have that sort of critical framework, because I can't completely escape it.
Yeah, we can't just totally throw out the baby in the bathwater.
No, that would be bad, but also somehow, like, fitting for this book.
It would be fitting for this specific thing we're talking about, but alas.
There's There's a recent edited collection that has come out entitled Horror Comes Home, Essays on Hauntings, Possessions, and Other Domestic Terrors in Cinema. And in the introduction, they actually specifically talk about Stephen King, and so I thought that was kind of, I just want to read this paragraph because I think it's really nice. So it says, as children, we are no strangers to the horrors of home. They lurk beneath the bed, down the hall, or just the other side of the closet door. Misshapen fingers creep across the wall as tree branches move in the moonlight, and floorboards creak beneath the weight of unseen menaces. We pull the covers tightly overhead and silently pray for morning. Stephen King writes, at night, when I go to bed, I still am at pains to be sure that my legs are under the blankets after the lights go out. I'm not a child anymore, but I don't like to sleep with one leg sticking out. Because if a cool hand ever reached out from under the bed and grasped my ankle, I might scream. Yes, I might scream to wake the dead. In the real world, the relief of daybreak comes. Rational minds prevail and life goes on. But as King confesses, those childhood fears rooted in the home are never fully vanquished. And then this is another quote from him. That sort of thing doesn't happen, of course, and we all know that. The thing under my bed waiting to grab my ankle isn't real. I know that, and I also know that if I'm careful to keep my foot under the covers, it will never be able to grab my ankle. And I think, you see so much of that, like, anxiety, that irrational anxiety at the heart of all of Stephen King's works, but especially the ones that are really domestic and home-based, which, again, is all Stephen King works. But I feel like the essence of that is sort of what I think much of Pet Sematary is trying to do. This idea that, like, we never completely are able to let go of our childhood irrational beliefs that if we just want something bad enough, it'll work out. If we lose a pet, someday we'll get to see that pet again.
Or if we lose a sister,
yes,
someday we can see that sister again, and that relationship will be fine, and
exactly.
it will all work out.
Exactly. And so I think, again, if we're thinking about, like, what makes a story so great and why it really is something that should be adapted and should be kind of re-examined, it's because at its heart, if we have this checklist, it does touch into something really profoundly disturbing.
And also, I think it does have some really powerful themes throughout, the themes about grief, longing, what it looks like to mourn.
Yes.
I think that, and these are themes that are not unique specifically to Stephen King. I mean, this is something that was also touched upon in Midsommar,
yes,
Hereditary, other things we've talked about on this very podcast. But those are good, universal themes that do allow for a rich discussion. And
yes.
offering of ideas.
And I would say that where this film shines are when it remembers that.
Exactly.
The parts, and so again, if we think of this checklist, I think part of my problem is that rather than saying, okay, but good, we got this like one big check of childhood fears manifested in adult situations. Instead, they were like, but also, let's kind of have a zombie-like element. Ooh, but also, let's have this, like, supernatural Native American god element. Ooh, but let's also have the body as a grotesque thing, right? And it's just like it was like, there was this thought that if they put in more items that can be checked off, that it will somehow make it better.
More scary.
Yes. Because
more marketable.
Right. Well, and I'm sure that is absolutely one of their thoughts, was that, if we want to reach the biggest demographic, we have to make sure that we have as many, like, here's what horror is boxes to check off. And in that way, I think the film failed itself.
I think so as well. Because just having all of these elements doesn't mean that they have successfully done all of these elements.
Correct. Nor does it mean that all of these elements can be in the same text.
Yeah, they don't. Just because they're all good tropes and elements of the genre and have worked successfully in the genre does not mean every element will work when you just throw it in all together.
And we've talked about this before. We talked about it with Us. That you cannot create an effective horror film if your answer is, here's a bag, reach your hand in, and pull out the horror of your choice. Like, that's just not an option.
And I will say, I think that at least with Jordan Peele's, with Us, it was at least he's setting up, he has made the bag and you reach in and he just wants you to interpret what it is. With this one, they've just dumped the bag everywhere and all of the things are everywhere and you can see everything. And
I think that is a good distinction. And I think that creates the situation where, so before we started recording, you were talking about how, like, you really saw this as being a clear, like, beginning, middle, and end type
Yes,
film.
I came up with a metaphor for it. Do indulge me, dear listeners, in a brief metaphor. I think Pet Sematary is a bit like a poop sandwich.
Huh. Okay.
I believe there is one piece of poop in the beginning, there is one piece of poop in the end, and in the middle, there is pretty good sandwich fillings. But, would you eat that sandwich? Does that mean that sandwich is good?
Yeah, and I think even if I feel bad using that metaphor, even though when I was rewatching the film, I really had to, like, focus, and I think I took a nap. So I watched it while I was flying, and I'm pretty sure at one point I paused it and I, like, slept for 20 minutes because I was just so bored that I just couldn't, like, stay awake. But even if you don't want to go with the poop sandwich metaphor, I think still the idea of, like, a sandwich metaphor works really nicely, where you could say that, like, the things on either end. You could even go with, like, rye bread, which I know lots of people like rye bread. I don't, because I think it's just...
That's why I went straight through the poop.
Yeah,
because I can't...
But some people liked it, though. That's the thing we have to remember, right? Is that it wasn't just, like, everyone... Because no one that I've ever met is like, yay, poop sandwich. But some people are going to be like, yay, rye bread. And I think that's what the filmmakers thought they were giving us, right? Is something that was like, you know, you have to have a bit of an acquired taste, but boy, if you do. But I'm not sure that's what happened. But what I find really interesting about your metaphor that I want you to elaborate on is that middle section.
Yes.
Right? So what is that middle section to you?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I think that the film really works for about 20-25 minutes. In the section from where Ellie is hit by the truck, all the way up until right after the scene with Ellie and her mother with the giving the hug. Just this whole section of dealing with the grief, the aftermath of the death, the return of Ellie, and the return of the mother and the son back to the house. And I think that whole section is... It feels out of place because it's so good in a film that the rest of it is so not good.
Yes.
That I was like, I remember like getting into it, like when I was watching the beginning, I was like, ugh, God, what a drag. I came to that section, I was like, wait a second. I totally misremembered this movie. This is excellent. This section is so good.
Yeah.
And then the end is very disappointing, and it diminishes all the goodwill it's built up in that 20-25 minutes, but...
So let's kind of go through it, because I think the beginning is where a lot of those checklist items are established.
Yes.
So again, if we go back to that one that they were like, and it is adapted from a Stephen King novel, and check. If you go to this fine print, what you have to remember, no Stephen King novel, except for Carrie, is short.
Yes.
And one of the reasons that Stephen King, I think, is so successful as a writer is that he has the space to build up in the first couple hundred pages, or in 500 pages, the characters, so that you truly care for them, you care for their situations, you realize that you're not a doctor in a small town, but that's okay, because you don't need to be.
You don't need to be.
No. But you can't do that effectively in a movie that's going to be approximately, I think it's like 100 minutes, right? And so you can't do that where you spend the first 30 or 40 minutes just giving us this, like, setup and this build-up, because nobody wants to see that.
101 minutes.
Excellent. And I know that because every so often I would pause the movie to see how much longer was in it. Because I was surprised in this rewatching by how long that beginning is.
Yeah, it's a long ending. And the pointless cold open doesn't help to make it any shorter.
Which I think is another checklist horror item, right? Grab people immediately with something that's going to, like, shock them. Right?
And I think, in theory, it's something that does make sense. How much of Stephen King's work is about this domestic home, and it's the beginning as this whole, like, you see the fire of this location, you see the home is destroyed. So I think in theory it makes sense. It's just that it serves no purpose.
No, because I feel that you have to know going into this film that it's going to inevitably end there, right? One of the reasons that we have those reveal beginnings, right, is because we want to sort of surprise people or remind people, like, but this isn't going to stay perfect.
This is where it's going.
But the film never has it be ideal, right? From the beginning, the wife is seeing and hearing things in the house of her sister. From the beginning, one of the first cases we see him having is the death of the student, and then he starts haunting him. Like, so you can't do that, right?
There was never any normalcy that they needed to break.
Exactly.
And so it just came off as yet just another... It's one of the cheap things that the film does to momentarily give the audience a moment of perhaps fright, fear.
And there's many moments, right, where we have that sort of like, do we have at least X number of jump scares?
Oh
Check.
my god. So, you know this about me.
I know.
You know I hate jump scares.
And you know I normally love them.
Yes, I do. I do know this is one of the things, even within this genre,
Yes.
which we both have established, we both do like, and we tend to agree
Yes.
with each other. This
But
is the
not
one
this.
thing where we don't 100% agree.
No. And that's okay.
It's okay.
But this film, again, I feel like a jump scare can be done really well and can serve a really good purpose. In this film, it truly did feel like it was a checkmark move.
Oh, yeah.
Especially in the introduction.
Oh my god. I wrote that down in my notes. That jump scare early on with the truck, the vroom.
Yes.
It foreshadowing so heavy. I was watching it with some people, and someone leaned over to me and said, "I don't know what they're foreshadowing, but they just foreshadowed it poorly."
Yeah, and I actually had less problems with that one than some of the other later jump scares in that introduction. But the truth of the matter is that the introduction makes it very clear that they're going to try to tick off as many boxes as possible. I think the inclusion of John Lithgow is another one, right? So not just the character of like, we have to have the slightly wise but slightly creepy old white man, but also the casting of John Lithgow, right? This is another
Beloved character actor.
That when and I won't lie, when I saw that he was going to be in this movie, I was so excited because I know what he's capable of doing.
He's a good actor.
Yes, but he had no opportunity.
Yeah, the script really does not give his character a lot. So it doesn't give his character a lot to do, and what it does give him to do doesn't make a lot of sense.
So this is another instance where the fine print is he'll be in this movie, but he's not going to make a lot of sense as a character, and he's going to have not much to work with.
And the character of Judd does make sense in the novel, I think. And
It's been so long since I've read it, I don't remember his character in the novel. All I can think about is the stupid line that he has in the film of like, well, I can't help but want to go back there, even though I know it's not going to work out. I shouldn't have shown it to you. Like, it was not set up well.
In the novel, it's more of like the pull and the draw of this location is more clearly established from the beginning and is carried throughout the whole thing. Whereas in this, it's just like a single throwaway line, a single reading from a book.
Yeah, it makes it seem like he's felt this like slight pull, but he didn't feel it strong enough to have acted on it in 50 years. That just makes no sense.
No.
And we have other things that, again, in this introduction, if we're creating this checklist, creepy children in masks.
The ritualistic nature of this.
That was one of their big sort of advertising things.
I was at the Austin City Limits Festival. No. I was at South by Southwest over spring break. Not because I was attending the festival. I don't have that kind of money. But I was there visiting one of my friends who had the money to attend the festival. And walking around the streets, the Pet Sematary, because it premiered at this film festival, they had the children walking around in the masks on the street. And I was like, oh, that's pretty good. That's pretty effective.
Yes.
That's pretty scary. That must be a big part of the movie.
And again, if we go back to...
It's not.
Yeah, well, and that's the problem, right? Is that if we go back to what King said, if we go back to this idea that this should be a film that is disturbing because we realize how many children's rituals are really macabre. And it's things like ring around the rosy when you find out that that's like referencing the plague and things like that. Or it's the fact that we say things to kids like, don't let the bugs bite. How creepy are we being, right? So there's all of these moments that, again, if that's what this film had been about, it would have been so effective. Instead, it was just a, do we have creepy children engaged in a ritual? Check.
One final checklisty type of thing that really gets established throughout this first part is the relationship between Rachel and her sister Zelda.
Yes.
And I say really gets established, but I should really be saying is half-heartedly established and kind of feels thrown in just so they can have that body horror. And
same with the gentleman Victor, right?
Right.
That is just like, okay, we see that you know how to pump fake blood. But you're right. It just feels like it's another thing to be added in there. But what's really interesting is
they've got to earn that R rating.
That's right.
And they've got to be edgy.
Yes, they do. But you know what's funny is that I remember in the original Pet Sematary being very disturbed by Zelda because they did such a better job of making her relevant to that particular film. But you're correct that she's just like, oh, good. In case you weren't sure where the source of horror is, let's also have it be A, body horror, but B, the past.
And it's just the silly nature of the conversation that gets them to this.
Yes.
This is the first time this couple is having a conversation about death. Really?
Yeah.
This is...
Yeah. And
they have children together.
And
they've been together.
Yeah, and you're right. It felt very much like one of those, like, what is this? Well, dear son, like...
Allow me to monologue real quick.
Yes, and then having the flashback, which there was something really wrong about the little girl that played Rachel, her hair in that scene. Like, they had her wearing this weird wig, so that, like, I wasn't sure with any of that. What is the point of this? Are you trying to show that this is a couple that has never talked about death? Because that seems strange, but maybe that's the way it is.
Maybe.
Are you trying to talk about someone that... Are we trying to talk about, like, domestic abuse where, like, they should have never left a 10-year-old to take care of someone, like, terminally broken? I mean, there's just, like, so many questions, but it's just kind of shoved in there.
Mm-hmm.
It's not even, like, built in. It's like they saw this tiny crack and they're like, oh, we need about 2 more minutes. Let's shove in this huge, big storyline that will take 10 minutes, but let's just force it in there.
Yeah, because it's like it's pretty significant.
It is.
In the novel.
It is.
I have not seen the movie in a good while. I don't really remember the 1980.
I just remember
movie.
being very disturbed by Zelda, more so than anything else in that film. Which I don't know if that was because, that is what's scary to a kid or not. But yeah, that's just something to think about. Because this issue of, like, what are we supposed to be afraid of really becomes, I think, for me, the fundamental flaw of this film when we talk about the conclusion.
Oh, yeah.
It is ridiculous.
Conclusion is so bonkers and so just feels like they had a bucket and they just threw it all.
Yes.
Everything.
Yes, and so we have the homicidal child.
Yep.
We have the matricide and patricide.
Yep.
We have the zombies.
Yep.
We have the house burning down.
Yep.
We have the threat to the tiny little rather adorable child.
Correct.
It's just like, you're right. It's and we have what else? No. We even have, like, the fog, right? I mean, there's just so much that's happening. We even have the fog. There's just so much that's happening at that moments of the final part of the film that it's just not acceptable.
Mm-hmm. And that whole descent into madness at the end is made so frustrating by the fact that, as we talked about earlier, there's that brilliant middle section that handles the themes of grief so well, I would say.
And here's where I think a checklist can actually be useful. So one of the reasons that Anthony and I have been thinking about this checklist is that I'm getting ready to teach a class on the home and horror, and I assume most of the students are going to be casually aware of horror. When I sent them an email reminding them that it was going to be scary movies that we're watching, no one jumped ship. So I assume they all want to be there. But there is kind of this question of, like, do we need to build up a generic definition, which I'm not usually, if ever, a big fan of.
I also am not a big fan.
But it serves a purpose, right? Especially in a class that's on a specific genre. But as we were thinking about that, we immediately began to realize that there are films like Pet Sematary that, by all definition, if you have a checklist, you should be like, well, this is the best film that has ever come out. And And so that kind of got us thinking about it. But I want to talk about the fact that I think that part of what makes the middle successful is they refined their checklist.
Yes. So, in this middle section, there are no jump scares.
That is true.
There aren't. After the obvious big one of the death of Ellie, but that didn't feel like a jump scare to me. It's just like very much, like, is it loud?
Yes. Were you maybe perhaps surprised, especially if you were familiar with the version where Gage dies, right? That, like, you're like, okay, well then what happened here, right? Like, so there was some surprise element, but it was not a jump scare.
No. From there on out, there was none of the cheap jump scares that the first part of the film had relied so heavily on for all of their sources of horror. For here, in this middle section, they kind of switched the source of horror from look at what we can do with this loud marrying of this boom to this crazy image, or the fake blood, we can pump the fake blood,
right,
to this, let's slow it down and let's switch it to a thoughtful kind of meditation of grief and horror and what you would do and the implications of if you could bring your dead daughter back to life. And
so do we still have things like disillusion of family? Check.
Yeah.
Right? But now it's, okay, well, we're not going to do everything in this section, so what would we want to include? Right? And I think about the makeup. The makeup in this part with Ellie was fantastic.
And her performance.
Oh, and her performance, yes. Neither of us are super fond of children kind of period, but child actors especially, but she did so well in this section. And there was a couple places she did really well. She did really well when they're laying in bed, like, and I was like, get out of that bed, that is so disturbing.
The bathtub scene was excellent.
The dancing scene,
yes. And it all came to like this incredible scene, which is the best scene in the movie. I think we both agree, between Ellie and her mother Rachel. Like, give a hug,
hug your daughter, and she is simultaneously nodding her head yes and shaking her head no. And so again, if we have that checklist, understated makeup, unlike the blood squirting out or Zelda, instead you can just see her veins. She's just a little bit more translucent.
And it's so much of it comes from her performance, rather than just anything they've superimposed onto her.
Exactly. So we have that, right? Again, so we have a checklist, but it's a smart checklist. We have a conflicted character, which you kind of need in a horror moment checklist. And so really, like, this section works because they understood that there's a reason having a checklist is helpful, but you have to be refined in it, and you have to be delicate in how you achieve it.
It's very true, because the section works very masterfully, because it really kind of takes away two characters. I mean, Rachel and Gage are removed.
Yes.
So it's really just focusing on three characters. So they've inherently kind of limited it.
Yes.
And you see Jason Clarke's character, Lewis, really go through a character shift here. And there's a lot of really good character moments here that lead to these true elements of horror. And it's very moving, like very disturbed. And it works so well.
Even the part that I thought was a little bit more flawed, where Ellie shifts into Judd's wife and shifts back to Ellie.
Oh, I would put that after.
Okay, good. Because I was going to say, but even that part, which is at the tail end of the sequence, right, does a good job of trying to at least say, okay, well, let's stay consistent. We have these 5 things that we have agreed to check off. Let's make sure those are the only 5 things we're working on, or, you know, whatever, that's a made-up number. But I think that's where the film shined. Part of the reason, though, I think that middle section, which, again, in terms of the 101 minutes, is not the middle section.
No, it does not fall.
No,
right, like
it falls about 70 minutes in.
Yeah.
Because I remember that after it happened, I was like, but I know there's so much more that's going to happen, and they just, like, cram it into the last 10 minutes. One of the reasons I thought that section was so effective is that I think it revealed what should really have been sort of the tagline. So one of the taglines I feel of the film is Judd's line of, you know, what's dead should stay dead. I don't think that's actually what's disturbing about this film. I think what's disturbing is more something like, sometimes what's broken can never be fixed.
Yes.
And it starts with, and then if we have that be the, like, tagline, almost everything else then begins to have more relevance.
And if that is the thing that they had centered on and had gone in with something more like that, I think they would have trimmed some elements.
I think they could have made the relationship between Rachel and Lewis so that if this is the first time they're having this weird conversation about death, we feel like that makes sense because this is a couple that's kind of
broken.
Yeah. Instead, it was like, oh yeah, it was a little broken because we were in Boston, but it's so much better now. There was none of that, like, lingering remnants.
No.
That I think is, again, what makes the story so effective. And would have been a perfect, if they had said, this is our item, how do we build a checklist from this? I think that would have been beautiful. Instead of like, here's a horror film, let's throw in everything, like you said, then let's throw it out and just start checking stuff off.
Yep. And then people will be afraid.
Yes. Which we were.
We were.
But
we were
not,
horrified.
Yes. But just not because of the checklist items.
Correct.
So, dear listeners, if you're going to make a film and you want to try to, like, have that challenge of, like, checking things off of this horror genre, do it.
Do it. Just make sure your themes and what you are trying to say is extremely clear.
Yes.
And that is what's driving the checklist.
Yes.
Not, hey, I've got a whole bunch of fake blood back here. What if we just, like, did some stuff with that?
In teaching, there's this idea of backward design where you begin with the objective that you want and then you go backwards and figure out the assignments that you want students to do, the text that you want them to read. Instead of getting all excited and be like, I'm going to have them read this text and I don't care if it fits. I'm going to have them do this assignment.
I mean, that's the same thing in acting, too.
Exactly.
Where you have your objective and every single thing goes to further this objective.
Exactly.
That's what every action you take.
And you have to start there, right? You don't begin with some quirk that you want to build into your character.
It's not like, hey, I've got this limp.
Yes. It's my character is this, so what would that mean? And I feel like if this film had done that, I feel like if many horror films would do that, right? If they would start with the end goal first and then work their way backwards, it would make for a really effective film.
Yeah.
Our next film is going to be the 2006 Kiwi Splatter, which is New Zealand horror. That's the genre for it. Black Sheep. And I think what makes Black Sheep a really nice choice after Pet Sematary is first we're continuing with our, like, evil animal motif.
Yeah.
But also...
very important to the podcast.
It is super important. I think every podcast should have an evil animal motif. But also, you know, if you're thinking about, like, a checklist, scary cat that comes back from the dead, evil child that comes back from the dead, like, these are things that you're like, yeah, this would be in a good film. Were-sheep is maybe not something that is on the average person's checklist for a good horror film. But I think that this is...
Do scary sheep not keep you up at night, too?
You know, I mean, honestly, after this film, they do. But this is something to kind of be thinking about as we kind of continue on this exploration. So, I hope you will join us for our next discussion on the 2006 film Black Sheep. In the meantime...
remember to like, share us with your friends, subscribe, do all that fun jazz things, and then be sure to tune in to us next time.